cold open. Everyone knows the Great Pyramid of Giza. For thousands of years, it has stood as one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. But it wasn't the beginning. Long before the first pyramid rose above the Egyptian desert, people across different parts of the world were already building remarkable monuments, structures that still leave archaeologists searching for answers. Today, these forgotten places are changing what we thought we knew about the origins of civilization. Today, we're exploring 10 ancient structures that are older than the pyramids, and the extraordinary people who built them. Let's begin with number 10. Number 10. Tell Qaramel, located in northern Syria, one of humanity's earliest stone towers. If you wanted to trace the origins of monumental architecture, Egypt might seem like the obvious place to start. But history points somewhere else. Nearly 12,000 years ago, in what is now northern Syria, a small community built one of the earliest known stone towers in human history. Hidden beneath layers of earth for thousands of years, the site of Tell Qaramel preserves a chapter of our past that few people have ever heard of. Yet it challenges long-held ideas about the beginnings of civilization. Located about 25 kilometers north of modern Aleppo, Tell Qaramel remained largely overlooked until systematic excavations began in 1999. As archaeologists peeled back layer after layer of soil, they uncovered evidence of a settlement far older than anyone had expected. Radiocarbon dating placed the earliest occupation at around 10,600 BC. That makes Tell Qaramel one of the oldest known permanent settlements ever discovered. At a time when much of humanity was still living by hunting and gathering, the people here had already begun putting down roots. Yet it wasn't the settlement itself that surprised archaeologists the most. It was the towers. Several circular stone towers were uncovered. Each was built during different phases of the settlement's history. The largest measured more than 7 meters across. It was carefully constructed from stacked limestone blocks. For a community living nearly 12,000 years ago, this was an extraordinary engineering achievement. Every stone had to be collected, transported, positioned, stabilized, all without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals. Everything depended on human effort, careful planning, and cooperation. That immediately raises an obvious question. Why build a tower at all? The truth is, no one knows for certain. Some archaeologists believe the towers served as lookout points overlooking the surrounding landscape. Others suggest they were communal gathering places, or places with ceremonial significance. Another possibility is that they acted as symbols of the settlement itself, reflecting a growing sense of identity within the community. None of these explanations has been conclusively proven, and that's part of what makes Tell Qaramel so fascinating. Archaeology often tells us what people built. Understanding why they built it is sometimes far more difficult. The towers were only part of the story. Excavations also uncovered stone tools, grinding stones, fireplaces, animal bones, and the remains of simple homes. Together, these discoveries reveal a community living through one of the greatest transitions in human history. Hunting remained important, but people were beginning to cultivate plants, settle permanently, and invest in places they intended to occupy for generations. That shift changed everything. Permanent communities made long-term construction possible. Long-term construction encouraged cooperation, and cooperation became one of the foundations upon which every later civilization would eventually be built. For many years, historians assumed monumental architecture appeared only after large agricultural societies had developed. Tell Qaramel suggests the story may be far older. The desire to build together may have emerged before civilizations reached the form we usually recognize today. The first great monuments were not raised by kings. They were built by ordinary people, working towards something larger than themselves. And remarkable as these early towers were, they represented only the beginning. A few thousand years later, another community would construct an even larger stone tower, one so impressive that archaeologists are still debating its true purpose today. That brings us to number 9. Number 9. Tower of Jericho, located in the West Bank of Palestine. The tower that shouldn't have existed. If Tell Qaramel marked one of humanity's earliest experiments with monumental construction, Jericho proved those experiments were only the beginning. Nearly 10,000 years ago, in the Jordan Valley, an ancient community built something that still leaves archaeologists searching for answers. A massive stone tower, unlike anything else known from its time. Jericho grew around one of the region's few reliable freshwater springs, making it an ideal place for people to settle long before written history began. Generation after generation returned to this fertile oasis, gradually transforming it into one of the world's oldest, continuously inhabited settlements. During excavations in the 1950s, British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon uncovered one of the site's most extraordinary discoveries. Hidden beneath thousands of years of later occupation stood a circular stone tower approximately 8.5 meters tall and nearly 9 meters wide at its base. Radiocarbon dating showed it had been built around 8000 BC. That was more than 5,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its size alone was remarkable. But what archaeologists found inside made the discovery even more surprising. A carefully constructed staircase climbed through the interior of the tower. It was made up of 22 stone steps leading toward the top. Every step had been deliberately shaped and positioned, revealing a level of planning few researchers expected from such an early community. Building a structure like this demanded far more than physical strength. Thousands of limestone blocks had to be quarried, transported, and assembled without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, and without large domesticated animals. The project would have required careful organization and the combined effort of many people working toward the same goal. The tower did not stand alone. Nearby, archaeologists uncovered a substantial stone wall enclosing part of the settlement. Together, these two structures represent some of the earliest large-scale communal construction projects ever discovered. For decades, researchers believed the explanation was straightforward. The wall and tower were thought to be defensive structures built to protect the settlement from attack. But as new evidence emerged, that interpretation became less certain. Some archaeologists now argue the wall may have helped protect the community from seasonal flooding rather than human enemies. Others have proposed that the tower itself served a ceremonial purpose. They point to its possible alignment with the setting sun during the summer solstice. No single explanation has gained universal acceptance, and that uncertainty continues to make Jericho one of the most fascinating archaeological sites in the world. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries don't answer old questions. They create entirely new ones. Excavations throughout the settlement also uncovered mud brick houses, storage facilities, grinding stones, cultivated crops, and countless everyday tools. Together, these discoveries reveal a society undergoing a profound transformation. People were no longer simply moving from place to place in search of food. They were building permanent communities, growing crops, storing harvests, planning for the future. As settlements became larger, so did the challenges of living together. Organizing food, labor, and construction required new forms of cooperation that had never existed before. The Tower of Jericho stands as a monument to that change. It reminds us that monumental architecture did not suddenly appear alongside powerful kingdoms or wealthy empires. Its roots reach much deeper into prehistory, where ordinary communities were already capable of achieving extraordinary things. But while Jericho demonstrated how people could unite to build monumental public works, another settlement was beginning to transform daily life itself. Its greatest achievement wasn't a single tower. It was an entirely new way of living together. That brings us to number 8. Number 8. Herokidea, located on the island of Cyprus, one of humanity's first planned villages. If Jericho showed that early communities could organize monumental construction, Herokidea reveals something equally important. They had also learned how to build a place they truly intended to call home. Nearly 9,000 years ago, on the island of Cyprus, a small farming community created one of the world's earliest planned villages. Unlike the temporary camps of earlier hunter-gatherers, this was a settlement designed for permanence. It was a place where generations would live, work, and grow together. Herokidea sits in the Moroni River Valley of southern Cyprus. Although the site had been known for centuries, it wasn't until the 1930s that systematic excavations began under archaeologist Porphyrios Dikaios. What emerged from the ground was one of the best-preserved Neolithic villages ever discovered. Radiocarbon dating shows that people lived here between 7,000 and 5,800 BC. That makes the settlement thousands of years older than Egypt's pyramids. Unlike Tell Qaramel or Jericho, Herokidea isn't remembered for a single monumental structure. Its importance lies in the village itself. Dozens of circular stone houses were carefully arranged across the hillside. They were connected by narrow pathways that wound between the homes. Thick limestone foundations supported mud brick walls. The roofs were likely built from timber, reeds, and packed earth. The layout wasn't random. It reflected a community following shared building traditions and a clear sense of organization. Step inside one of these homes. The picture becomes even clearer. Raised platforms served as beds. Hearths provided warmth and a place to prepare food. Storage bins protected valuable grain harvested from nearby fields. Stone tools and household objects were kept within easy reach. These weren't shelters built for a single season. They were homes built for a lifetime. One of the most moving discoveries lay beneath the floors. Archaeologists found the remains of men, women, and children, all buried directly beneath the houses where they had lived. This suggests that families maintained a close connection with their ancestors, keeping the memory of previous generations at the heart of everyday life. The village also produced a remarkable collection of artifacts: flint blades, polished stone axes, bone needles, grinding stones, shell ornaments, decorative beads. Together, these discoveries reveal a community with skilled craftspeople and well-established daily routines. Some materials originated from distant locations. This shows that the inhabitants were already connected to wider networks of exchange across the eastern Mediterranean. Surrounding part of the settlement was a substantial stone wall. Like the wall at Jericho, its exact purpose remains uncertain. It may have offered protection from wild animals. It may have marked the boundary of the village. Or it may have symbolized the identity of the community itself. Whatever its original function, the wall reflects careful planning and a willingness to reshape the landscape. Herokidea marks an important turning point in human history. For countless generations, survival depended on following food wherever it could be found. Here, people chose a different path. They settled in one place, cultivated the land, raised animals, and built homes intended to endure. In many ways, villages like Herokidea laid the foundations for every town and city that would eventually follow. The idea of permanent community had become a reality. Yet even this remarkable village would soon be surpassed. Across the sea in central Turkey, another settlement was growing to a scale few archaeologists once believed possible. Thousands of people would live together in a place with no streets, no front doors, and no obvious rulers. It would become one of the most extraordinary communities of the prehistoric world. That brings us to number 7. Number 7. Çatalhöyük, located on the Konya Plain in central Turkey, the city without streets. If Kirokitia showed how permanent villages began to take shape, Çatalhöyük reveals what happened when those villages grew beyond anything people had seen before. Imagine living in a town where there were no streets, no front doors, no sidewalks. To visit your neighbor, you climbed onto your roof. You walked across the rooftops of dozens of other homes. Then you climbed down a ladder through an opening in the ceiling. As strange as that sounds today, this was everyday life nearly 9,000 years ago. Çatalhöyük was first identified in 1958. It rose to international prominence after British archaeologist James Mellart began excavations in the early 1960s. Since then, decades of research have transformed it into one of the best understood Neolithic settlements in the world. Radiocarbon dating shows that people first settled here around 7400 BC. The community remained occupied for roughly 12 centuries before it was eventually abandoned. At its peak, as many as 8,000 people may have lived here. For its time, that was an extraordinary population. What makes Çatalhöyük so remarkable isn't just its size. It's the way it was built. The houses stood wall against wall, forming a continuous maze of mud brick buildings. There were no roads separating neighborhoods because the rooftops themselves served as the village's pathways. People moved across the settlement from above before climbing into their homes through roof openings, using wooden ladders. It was a completely different way of designing a community. And surprisingly, it worked. Building homes so closely together helped conserve heat. It strengthened the settlement. It also reduced the number of exposed entrances. Every roof became part of the village's transportation system. Inside, daily life was carefully organized. Raised platforms served as beds and seating areas. Hearths and ovens were used for cooking. Storage bins protected harvested grain. The walls were repeatedly covered with fresh layers of plaster, showing that these homes were maintained and repaired for generations. Yet some of the most remarkable discoveries were found on those very walls. Archaeologists uncovered paintings of hunting scenes, geometric patterns, wild animals. In several homes, real bullhorns had been embedded into the walls. Carefully crafted human figures hint at beliefs that are still not fully understood. These houses weren't simply places to sleep. They were places where family life, memory, and ceremony came together. Like the people of Kirokitia, the inhabitants of Çatalhöyük buried many of their dead beneath the floors of their homes. Some houses contain burials from multiple generations. This suggests that families remained closely connected to their ancestors long after death. Excavations also revealed finely crafted obsidian blades, polished stone tools, woven textiles, decorative beads, evidence of long-distance trade. Materials moved across hundreds of kilometers, showing that Çatalhöyük was part of a much larger network connecting communities throughout the region. Perhaps the most surprising discovery, however, is what archaeologists didn't find. No obvious palaces, no monumental temples, no lavish royal tombs. Most homes are remarkably similar in size and construction. This has led many researchers to suggest that Çatalhöyük may have functioned without powerful kings or rigid social hierarchies. Although that idea is still debated, it challenges many traditional assumptions about how large communities were organized. Çatalhöyük shows that thousands of people could live together, trade, build, and maintain a thriving settlement long before the rise of the great civilizations we usually associate with cities. It wasn't simply a larger village. It was a new way of organizing human life. But while the people of Çatalhöyük were redefining how communities could function, another group living farther south was looking beyond the land itself. Their attention was fixed on the sky. There, a circle of carefully positioned stones may have become one of humanity's earliest attempts to track the rhythm of the seasons. That brings us to number 6. Number 6. Nabta Playa. Located in southern Egypt, the ancient stones that may have measured the sky. If Çatalhöyük showed how people transformed the way they lived, Nabta Playa reveals something just as remarkable. They were beginning to understand the world above them. Long before the pyramids appeared along the Nile, and long before ancient Egypt became one of history's greatest civilizations, small pastoral communities gathered deep within what is now the Sahara Desert. There they arranged massive stones in ways that continue to spark debate among archaeologists today. At first glance, Nabta Playa doesn't look impressive. There are no towering temples, no monumental walls, no giant statues, just a quiet stretch of desert scattered with carefully placed stones. Yet those stones may represent one of humanity's earliest attempts to connect architecture with the movements of the sky. Nabta Playa lies about 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel in southern Egypt. Today the landscape is harsh and dry, but around 8,000 years ago it was dramatically different. Seasonal rains filled shallow lakes across the region, creating fertile grazing grounds that attracted groups of pastoral people and their cattle. Archaeologists began investigating the site during the 1970s under the direction of Fred Wendorf and his international research team. As excavations expanded, they uncovered stone circles, standing megaliths, burial mounds, carefully arranged alignments unlike anything previously known from this period in North Africa. Radiocarbon dating indicates that people occupied the area between approximately 7,500 and 5,500 BC. Among the most intriguing discoveries is a small stone circle only a few meters across. Its size isn't what makes it extraordinary. Its alignment is. Several researchers noticed that certain stones appear to line up with the direction of the sunrise during the summer solstice, the time of year that marked the return of seasonal rains. For communities whose survival depended on water and healthy grazing land, recognizing that moment would have been critically important. If the interpretation is correct, the builders weren't simply arranging stones. They may have been creating a seasonal calendar. That possibility has made Nabta Playa one of the most discussed prehistoric sites in Africa. At the same time, archaeologists remain cautious. Not everyone agrees that the alignments were intentionally astronomical. Changes to the landscape over thousands of years, along with the limited amount of surviving evidence, make definitive conclusions difficult. For now, the debate remains open. What isn't disputed is the effort required to build the site. The stones were deliberately selected, transported, positioned with care. Nearby excavations also uncovered ceremonial cattle burials, suggesting that livestock held an importance extending far beyond everyday survival. These weren't simply herding communities. They were communities developing shared traditions, rituals, beliefs. Nabta Playa offers a glimpse into a moment when human attention was beginning to expand beyond immediate survival. The changing seasons, the movement of the sun, the rhythm of nature. These patterns were becoming part of the way people understood their world. Whether the stone circle functioned as an observatory, a ceremonial space, or something entirely different, it reflects a society capable of planning ahead, working together, giving lasting meaning to the landscape around them. In many ways, Nabta Playa reminds us that civilization isn't measured only by cities or monuments. It's also measured by curiosity, by the desire to observe, to understand, and to find order in the world. Yet while the people of Nabta Playa were looking toward the heavens, communities in Western Europe were turning their attention somewhere else. They were building monuments not for the living, but for the dead. That brings us to number 5. Number 5. Cairn of Barnenez, located in Brittany, northwestern France, one of the world's oldest megalithic tombs. If the people of Nabta Playa were watching the sky, the builders of Barnenez turned their attention somewhere far more personal. They built for the dead. Thousands of years before Stonehenge appeared on the English landscape, An enormous stone monument already overlooked the rugged coastline of northwestern France. At first glance, it resembles nothing more than a grassy hill. But hidden beneath that mound lies one of the oldest surviving examples of monumental architecture in Europe. Known today as the Cairn of Barnenez, the monument stands on the Brittany coast overlooking the Bay of Morlaix. For centuries, no one realized what it truly was. In the 1950s, workers began removing stones from the mound for road construction. As sections of the hill disappeared, carefully built stone chambers started to emerge. Archaeologists quickly intervened. What seemed to be an ordinary hill was revealed as one of prehistory's most remarkable discoveries. Radiocarbon dating shows that the earliest sections of Barnenes were built around 4800 BC. That was more than 2,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its scale is astonishing. The monument stretches roughly 72 meters in length. It reaches about 25 meters in width. It rises nearly 8 meters high. Building it required an estimated 13,000 to 14,000 tons of stone, all transported and assembled without metal tools or wheeled vehicles. Inside the mound, archaeologists uncovered 11 separate passage graves. Each was connected to its own burial chamber through a narrow stone corridor. Massive upright slabs support equally enormous capstones, creating stable chambers that have remained standing for more than 6,000 years. Some of those stones carry mysterious carvings, axes, bows, wave-like patterns, geometric symbols. Their meanings have been lost with time. They may represent religious beliefs, clan identities, or something entirely different. Without written records, archaeologists can only compare the evidence and develop careful interpretations. One thing, however, is beyond doubt. Barnenes was not built all at once. Evidence shows the monument expanded over generations, with new chambers added as the community grew. The people who began construction knew they would never see the finished monument. They built it anyway. That tells us something remarkable about the society behind it. Projects lasting decades or even generations require more than skilled builders. They require planning, cooperation, and a shared belief that the monument would remain important long after its original builders were gone. Barnenes also reflects a changing relationship with death. Rather than burying people in isolated graves, these communities invested enormous effort into creating a shared resting place that became a permanent landmark. The monument preserved not only the memory of individuals, but also the identity of the community itself. It marks the beginning of Europe's great tradition of megalithic monuments. Over the following millennia, massive stone structures would appear across Britain, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and the Mediterranean. Each culture developed its own style, but they all shared one powerful idea. Stone could preserve memory. Long after voices had fallen silent, the monuments would remain. Barnenes reminds us that architecture had become more than a practical skill. It had become a way of expressing belief, identity, and remembrance. Yet even this extraordinary monument would soon be surpassed. On a small island in the heart of the Mediterranean, another community was preparing to build something unlike anything the prehistoric world had ever seen. Not a tomb, but one of humanity's earliest freestanding stone temples. That brings us to number 4. Number 4. Gigantea Temples. Located on the island of Gozo in Malta, the world's oldest freestanding stone temples. If Barnenes showed how prehistoric communities honored the dead, the next monument reveals something equally extraordinary. They also built places for the living to gather, to worship, and to perform ceremonies. On the Mediterranean island of Gozo stand the Gigantea temples, among the oldest freestanding stone structures ever built. Long before the temples of ancient Greece and centuries before Egypt's first pyramid, these remarkable buildings had already become the center of community life. The name Gigantea comes from the Maltese word for giant. According to local legend, only giants could have lifted stones so enormous. Standing among the ruins today, it's easy to see why people believe the story. Radiocarbon dating shows the temples were built between approximately 3600 and 3200 BC. That makes them some of the oldest surviving freestanding stone temples in the world. Many of the limestone blocks weigh more than 50 tons. Moving stones of that size would be challenging even with modern machinery. Yet the people who built Gigantea had neither iron tools nor wheeled vehicles. Every block had to be quarried, transported, carefully positioned, using methods that archaeologists are still working to understand. The complex actually consists of two adjoining temples enclosed within a shared outer wall. Inside, each follows a distinctive cloverleaf design. A central passage leads visitors through a series of rounded chambers, creating a layout that was clearly planned rather than improvised. Nothing about these buildings feels accidental. The builders understood balance, symmetry, structural stability, and how architecture could shape the experience of those moving through the space. Excavations uncovered stone altars, offering platforms, fire pits, and large quantities of animal bones. These discoveries suggest that ritual activities formed the heart of the complex. Exactly what those ceremonies involved remains unknown. Without written records, archaeologists cannot say with certainty who was worshipped here or what beliefs guided the community. Among the most intriguing discoveries are a number of carved stone figurines depicting unusually large female forms. Often called the Fat Lady statues, they have traditionally been linked to fertility or motherhood. However, modern researchers remain cautious. While those interpretations are possible, the evidence isn't strong enough to confirm exactly what these figures represented. The temples also appear to have been carefully aligned with the rising sun at certain times of the year. Whether those alignments served practical, ceremonial, or symbolic purposes continues to be debated, but they demonstrate that the builders paid close attention to the landscapes surrounding them. Perhaps the greatest achievement of Gigantea isn't the size of its stones. It's what those stones represent. Building monuments on this scale required hundreds of people working together over many years, quarrying, transporting, assembling enormous blocks. All demanded planning, leadership, and a shared commitment to something greater than any individual. These weren't temporary gathering places. They were monuments designed to endure. For thousands of years, they have done exactly that. Gigantea reminds us that architecture had become more than shelter or survival. It had become an expression of belief, of identity, of community. Yet even these extraordinary temples weren't the final step in humanity's architectural journey. Far to the northwest, another monument would combine engineering with an astonishing understanding of the movement of the sun. For just a few minutes each year, light itself would become part of the architecture. That brings us to number 3. Number 3. Newgrange, located in Ireland's Boyne Valley. The tomb that awakens with the winter sun. If the temples of Gigantea showed how architecture could shape sacred space, Newgrange reveals something even more extraordinary. Here, architecture was designed to work with light itself. Imagine standing inside a stone chamber in complete darkness. For most of the year, not a single ray of sunlight reaches the room. Then, on one winter morning, everything changes. As the sun rises on the winter solstice, a narrow beam of light enters through a small opening above the entrance. It travels the length of a 19-meter passage. Then it slowly illuminates the chamber at the monument's center. The display lasts only a few minutes. Then the darkness returns for another year. That moment has repeated itself for more than 5,000 years. Located in Ireland's Boyne Valley, Newgrange is one of Europe's most remarkable prehistoric monuments. From the outside, it appears as a large circular mound surrounded by 97 massive curbstones. Many of those stones are decorated with intricate spiral carvings that remain among the finest examples of Neolithic art. Radiocarbon dating places its construction at around 3200 BC. That makes Newgrange more than 5 centuries older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Although often described as a passage tomb, the monument is far more sophisticated than that title suggests. A narrow stone corridor leads deep into the mound before opening into a cruciform central chamber built from enormous stone slabs. Above it rises a carefully engineered corbelled roof, where each layer of stone slightly overlaps the one below until the structure closes at the top. More than 5,000 years later, the chamber remains remarkably dry. That alone is an extraordinary engineering achievement. But Newgrange is remembered for something even more remarkable. Just above the entrance sits a narrow opening known today as the roof box. It looks almost insignificant. Yet every winter solstice, sunlight passes through that opening with astonishing precision. It fills the chamber with golden light. This wasn't a lucky coincidence. It was deliberate design. The builders understood exactly where the sun would appear on the horizon during the shortest days of the year. They aligned the monument accordingly. Even a small error in construction would have prevented the light from reaching the chamber. Excavations uncovered cremated human remains, stone basins, beads, bone pins, carefully crafted artifacts. These discoveries indicate that Newgrange held great ceremonial importance. Only a small number of people were buried here. That suggests the monument served a purpose far greater than an ordinary cemetery. Exactly what that purpose was remains uncertain. Some archaeologists believe the returning sunlight symbolized renewal after the darkest days of winter. Others argue that the monument acted as a ceremonial gathering place where seasonal events reinforced shared beliefs and community identity. Without written records, no interpretation can be confirmed with complete certainty. Yet one conclusion is difficult to dispute. The builders possessed an extraordinary understanding of architecture, engineering, and the annual movement of the sun. Every measurement mattered. Every stone had a purpose. Even the carvings covering the entrance stones continue to raise questions. Spirals, zigzags, diamonds, concentric circles. Their meaning has never been fully understood. Whether they recorded religious ideas, astronomical observations, or symbols now lost to history, remains one of Newgrange's enduring mysteries. It isn't simply a monument built from stone. It's a monument built from knowledge. For one brief moment each year, sunlight completes the design, exactly as its builders intended more than 5,000 years ago. Even today, it still works. Yet remarkable as Newgrange is, another prehistoric monument would become even more famous. Its towering stones have inspired myths, legends, scientific debate for centuries. And despite being one of the most studied archaeological sites on Earth, many of its greatest mysteries remain unsolved. That brings us to number 2. Number 2, Stonehenge, located on Salisbury Plain in southern England. The monument that refused to give up its secrets. If Newgrange demonstrated how ancient builders mastered light, Stonehenge raises an even bigger question. How did prehistoric people move and precisely position stones weighing more than 25 tons? For centuries, no one had a convincing answer. Legends claimed giants built it. Others believed it was the work of druids, or even the legendary wizard Merlin. The real story is far more extraordinary. Stonehenge is one of the world's most famous prehistoric monuments. Yet despite generations of archaeological research, many of its greatest mysteries remain unsolved. Construction began around 3000 BC, but the monument wasn't built all at once. Instead, it evolved over nearly 15 centuries, with each generation adding new features to a ceremonial landscape that continued to grow in both scale and complexity. The earliest phase looked very different from the Stonehenge we know today. It began as a circular earthwork enclosed by a ditch and bank. Inside were a series of pits now known as the Aubrey Holes. Many of them later contained cremated human remains. Long before the great stones arrived, this was already an important ceremonial and burial site. Then came the transformation that made Stonehenge famous. Builders transported enormous sarsen stones from the Marlborough Downs, nearly 25 kilometers away. Many of those stones weighed more than 25 tons. But those weren't the only stones. The smaller bluestones came from the Priestley Hills in western Wales. That was a journey of more than 200 kilometers. Even today, moving stones over such distances would be a major engineering project. For prehistoric communities with no wheels, no iron tools, and no heavy machinery, it was an astonishing achievement. Exactly how they accomplished it is still debated. Most archaeologists believe the builders combined wooden sledges, rollers, ropes, waterways, and an enormous amount of human labor. Whatever method they used, the project demanded careful planning and cooperation on a remarkable scale. Transporting the stones, however, was only half the challenge. The builders then shaped the massive blocks and connected them using mortise and tenon joints, a woodworking technique adapted for stone. Horizontal lintels were locked securely onto upright pillars, creating structures strong enough to survive thousands of years of wind, rain, and changing seasons. It wasn't simply construction. It was engineering. Stonehenge also reveals an impressive understanding of astronomy. Each year, the rising sun on the summer solstice aligns closely with the monument's central axis. During the winter solstice, the setting sun creates a corresponding alignment in the opposite direction. Whether these alignments formed the monument's primary purpose or were just one part of a much larger ceremonial tradition remains uncertain. What archaeologists now know is that Stonehenge never stood alone. Excavations have uncovered nearby settlements, burial mounds, timber circles, ceremonial avenues. Additional monuments spread across the surrounding landscape. Together, they formed one of the largest ritual complexes in prehistoric Europe. That discovery changed the way researchers viewed the monument. Stonehenge wasn't an isolated circle of stones. It was the heart of an entire ceremonial landscape where communities gathered across generations to bury their dead, celebrate seasonal events, reinforce shared traditions. Perhaps that's why Stonehenge continues to capture the imagination. The more archaeologists uncover, the more questions emerge. How were the stones transported? Why was the monument rebuilt again and again? What ceremonies took place here? Many answers remain hidden, and that enduring mystery is part of what makes Stonehenge so compelling. For centuries, it seemed to represent the highest achievement of prehistoric architecture. Its scale, its engineering, its precision. Everything suggested humanity had reached a remarkable level of sophistication. Then, in the 1990s, archaeologists uncovered a site in southeastern Turkey that forced them to rethink everything they thought they knew. If Stonehenge showed what prehistoric people could achieve, the next discovery would reveal they had begun achieving it thousands of years earlier than anyone had imagined. That brings us to number one. Number one, Göbekli Tepe, located in southeastern Turkey, the discovery that rewrote the history of civilization. If Stonehenge represented the peak of prehistoric engineering, Göbekli Tepe changed something even more fundamental. It changed the story of civilization itself. For generations, archaeologists believed humanity followed a familiar path. First came agriculture, then permanent villages, then organized religion. Only after that did people possess the time, resources, and stability needed to build monumental architecture. It was a logical sequence. For decades, almost no one questioned it. Then came Göbekli Tepe. Perched on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, the site had been known for years. Most people assumed it was little more than another ancient mound scattered with broken stones. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt looked at the site and reached a very different conclusion. He believed something extraordinary was hidden beneath the surface. He was right. Excavations began the following year. What emerged from the ground surprised the archaeological world. Buried beneath thousands of years of soil were enormous circular enclosures built around towering T-shaped limestone pillars. Many stood more than 5 meters tall. Many weighed between 10 and 20 tons. These weren't natural rock formations. They had been carefully carved, transported, raised by human hands. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Radiocarbon dating placed the earliest construction at around 9600 BC. That means Göbekli Tepe is more than 7,000 years older than Stonehenge, more than 6,000 years older than Newgrange, and more than 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Nothing on this scale was supposed to exist so early in human history. Yet there it was, waiting beneath the earth for nearly 12,000 years. The pillars themselves are unlike anything found at any other prehistoric site. Their distinctive T-shaped form gives them an unmistakably human appearance. Several are carved with arms, hands, belts, and loincloths. Many archaeologists interpret them as stylized human figures rather than simple structural supports. Covering many of the pillars are beautifully carved reliefs of wild animals. Foxes, wild boars, snakes, scorpions, vultures, lions, cranes. Each animal was carved with remarkable confidence and precision, despite being created thousands of years before metal tools existed. Exactly what these carvings represent remains unknown. They may reflect religious beliefs, myths, clan symbols, or stories that disappeared long before writing was ever invented. The stones preserve the artwork, but not its meaning. Perhaps the greatest mystery isn't what was built, it's who built it. Evidence suggests the earliest builders were still primarily hunter-gatherers. Large-scale agriculture had not yet become firmly established in the region. If that's true, the implications are extraordinary. Hundreds of people organized themselves to quarry massive limestone blocks, transport stones weighing many tons, carve intricate reliefs, construct monumental architecture, all without cities, without kings, or fully developed farming societies. That possibility overturned one of archaeology's oldest assumptions. Perhaps civilization didn't create monuments. Perhaps monuments helped create civilization. Some archaeologists argue that large ceremonial gatherings at Göbekli Tepe encouraged people to cooperate more closely, remain in one place for longer periods, and eventually develop agriculture to support growing populations. Others remain more cautious, emphasizing that many questions about the site's purpose and chronology are still being investigated. The debate continues. And that's exactly what makes Göbekli Tepe so important. It doesn't simply answer old questions. It forces archaeologists to ask entirely new ones. Even today, much of the site remains unexcavated. Researchers estimate that only a small portion of Göbekli Tepe has been uncovered. The majority still lies buried beneath the hillside. Its greatest discoveries may still lie underground. Perhaps that's the most remarkable part of all. A monument nearly 12,000 years old is still rewriting history. Every excavation has the potential to change what we think we know about the origins of civilization. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that humanity's story is rarely as straightforward as it first appears. The first great builders didn't wait for kingdoms. They didn't wait for empires. They didn't wait for history to begin. Together, they created something so extraordinary that thousands of years later, it still challenges our understanding of the past. And that is why Göbekli Tepe stands at number 1. For thousands of years, the Great Pyramid of Giza has stood as one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. But after exploring these 10 remarkable sites, it's clear that the pyramids were never the beginning. They were the result of a story that had already been unfolding for thousands of years. From the early stone towers of Tell Qaramel to the remarkable engineering of Jericho, from the carefully planned village of Kirukitia to the thriving community of Çatalhöyük, from the stone alignments of Nabta Playa to the monumental tomb of Barnenes, the ancient temples of Gigantia, the winter sunlight of Newgrange, the enduring mystery of Stonehenge, and finally, the revolutionary discovery of Göbekli Tepe. Each monument reveals a different chapter in humanity's journey. Some represent new ways of building. Others reflect changing beliefs. Some show how communities learn to cooperate. Others reveal a growing understanding of nature, the seasons, and the sky. Taken together, they tell a far bigger story. Civilization was never created in a single place. It wasn't the achievement of one king, one culture, or one civilization. It was built slowly across thousands of years by countless communities whose names have long since been forgotten. Without metal tools, without machines, without written language. Yet somehow they measured landscapes, transported enormous stones, organized large construction projects, created monuments that continue to survive thousands of years later. Human progress has never been defined only by technology. It has always been driven by curiosity, cooperation, and the willingness to build something that would outlast a single lifetime. Every new archaeological discovery reminds us that our understanding of the past is still evolving. History is not finished. There are still chapters waiting to be uncovered. The pyramids may be the most famous monuments ever built, but they were never the first. Long before Egypt became one of history's greatest civilizations, people across the ancient world were already shaping stone, organizing communities, creating monuments whose stories continue to challenge what we thought we knew about the past. The sites we've explored today are more than archaeological discoveries. They are reminders that human imagination has always reached further than we often assume. And if history has taught us anything, it's that the next discovery capable of changing everything may already be waiting beneath our feet. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into humanity's distant past, be sure to subscribe for more documentaries exploring the people, discoveries, and forgotten civilizations that shaped our world. We'll see you in the next one.